to be with you. Thank you for having me this morning. Brothers and sisters, in 1963, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. penned a letter from his jail cell in Birmingham, Alabama. The letter was addressed to the white clergymen of the city. In that letter, he warned them that the biggest threat to the cause of civil rights in Birmingham was not the Ku Klux Klan, was not the White Citizens Council, nor even the hostile segregationist government and police force of the state. Rather, the greatest danger posed to civil rights was the white moderate. The white moderate who filled so many of the congregations of the ministers that King addressed. These moderates were men and women and their ministers and leaders who sympathized with, and in some ways even promoted, the cause of civil rights. These same people, however, would regularly accuse King and his followers of being too impatient, too extreme, and too bold in their acts of civil disobedience. King was accused of causing riots, disturbances, and of hurting his own cause. We have known something of this sentiment in recent weeks and months in our own country. And in the backs of the minds of these moderates, the good life, the Christian way, was governed by this principle. Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth. For the moderate, patience, calm, and meekness would win the day. And it was to this sentiment that King was called to respond in his now famous letter. King's reply to these calls for passivity and patience was to remind his readers that with every moment that they remained patient, thousands and thousands of black men and women remained subject to the imposition of physical pain and social and psychological degradation. As the billy clubs and the angry dogs crushed the bones and pierced the flesh of those who struggled in bondage, so too did the slurs of the hateful and the silence of the moderate crush the spirit and pierce the soul. In this oppressive silence, the invocation of the Beatitude beats against the eardrums like a death march. We cannot understand what it means that blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. And King's letter seems to sing a counter melody that takes a questioning tone. He asks, what kind of earth shall the meek inherit? For if it is an earth of injustice, of slavery and abuse, who in their right mind would want to inherit such earth? Now, brothers and sisters, obviously this is not the world that Christ has in mind when he tells us that the meek shall inherit the earth. But what do we do with the fact that so often acting meekly has led to the forces of tyranny and injustice being allowed to run rampant over the earth? Is this simply some spiritual platitude, irrelevant, and perhaps even contrary to the facts of history and the lived experience of human life? In light of this problem, we have to ask ourselves, what kind of earth can meekness achieve? What kind of earth does the biblical text call for us to inherit? The text itself seems to provide us with an answer. The word that we translate as earth in our gospel text, the word ge, has a very specific connotation. It does not mean world in the sense of all that exists, or even in the sense of the entire planet. The Bible employs a different word for this, the word cosmos, to indicate that. So embodying meekness then does not make us masters of the universe, nor does the verse imply that God uses his power to further this end if we but sit back and wait for him to act. To dominate our world is not what is promised for our inheritance. Rather, the word earth, as it is used in the Bible, refers to a particular and specific land. Indeed, though the tradition of English translation renders the word earth in Matthew 5. In many other verses of the biblical text, including Psalm 37, which we read today, the same word is translated interchangeably with the word land. Now, while in some passages this can literally mean a plot of dirt, for the most part, we translate the word earth or land as a concept similar to that with which Woody Guthrie sings in the song, "This land is your land, this land is my land." The earth we inherit, the land that meekness gets us, is a land in which we already have an affinity and a citizenship. It is a place that God has called us to belong. Inheriting the earth means that we come into a land long prepared for us, a land where we are and have always been meant to be, a good land, a land flowing with milk and honey, a promised land. Inheriting and coming into a promised land is one of the most important and powerful themes in biblical literature. It is the promise of God to Abraham. It is the assurance of the refugees from Egypt. It is the sustainment of the returning exiles from Babylon. It was the comfort of the Zionist movement of the 1940s. It was the cry of the southern slaves who sang of crossing the River Jordan, the ancient border of the Promised Land, and for the slaves, the metaphor for crossing into free states. And it was the resolve that steeled the will of the marchers who crossed the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma on Bloody Sunday on March 7, 50 years ago. This image, this covenant, this promise of God that we shall inherit the earth and come into our promised land has sustained and motivated struggling peoples across generations and cultures. Though progress is so often obscured by the seemingly unending wilderness of doubt and frustration, someday God promises us that we will see the promised land from the mountaintops, and more importantly, we shall enter in. However, despite this promise, like the Israelites before us, our sins, both personal and public, prevent us from making good on the promise. No matter what we do, it seems like the streams that should flow with milk and honey flow instead with bile and blood. The problem of squaring history with a biblical principle would perhaps be easily resolved if the promised land to which we were meant to enter was something otherworldly. Indeed, to resolve the problem of history's inability to achieve, let alone sustain, the promised land. The promised land which we are destined to inherit is often interpreted as heaven, something unreachable and therefore not meant for the here and the now. Indeed, those same slave spirituals with smoke of Jordan as the metaphor for the border to freedom also used it as a euphemism for death. For life under slavery was so terrible that release from it was a form of freedom, of entering into a promised land the weary might rest. But here again, the specificity of biblical language steers us away from the interpretation that the promised land is heaven. The word for earth is, in the account of creation in Genesis, specifically that which is set apart and divided from heaven. It is the physical world, the arena of human history and action. So while the promised land might point to an ideal, it is not an ideal that is meant to be passively left for the resolution of heaven, but rather an ideal that is meant to be striven for here in the messy, soiled, and dirty earth. Yet in all these examples I have mentioned, from Abraham's first call to the struggle to end slavery and its latter-day social effects, it doesn't seem that the road to the promised land is paved with anything resembling meekness. Look up the word meek in a dictionary or thesaurus, and you'll find that the word synonyms are things like unassuming, passive, easily put upon, quiet, gentle, submissive, and humble. But indeed, Abraham Lincoln, Martin Luther King, Men who led their people into literal and figurative promised lands are celebrated not for the meekness, as we most often understand the word, but rather for their boldness. And Matthew tells us that the meek and not the bold will inherit the earth. Is there some secret meaning, some ancient Greek context, some grammar in which the term meek means something totally different then that we take it to mean? In the biblical text, meek means exactly what we think it means. And because of this, we've wrestled with the question of how exactly the meek can inherit the earth and come into the promised land when it seems that the great exemplars of history and of the biblical literature itself do not possess this quality. Perhaps what is needed then is a shift not of meaning, but rather of perspective. While the Bible calls us to be humble and submissive, it never calls us to acquiesce to tyranny. While it advocates sacrificing oneself rather than harming even an enemy, never once does it call for someone to withhold protection from another. And in this way, submission is a personal and not a communal quality. But we do not enter the promised land as individuals. We walk as a community and as a nation. The Israelites escaped from Egypt, and the civil rights movement taught us this. Dr. King was prophetic when he said in his last public speech that he had seen the promised land, that he may not come into it personally, but that we as a nation were assured of promise into it. And so communal submission in the Bible is never to tyranny, because it is never to an earthly power. Rather, we are called to be meek, to be submissive, to be humble before God, and not before men. The psalmist tells us in Psalm 37 that we are to be still before the Lord, to wait upon the Lord. But this stillness and patience is not inactivity. Rather, the psalmist tells us that true humility comes in the form of obedience. We are to keep God's commands, and this is true submission. This is true humility. This is what it means to be meek. The psalmist tells us that we must do good, commit our ways to the Lord, and only in this activity, says the psalm, shall the meek inherit the land. But brothers and sisters, to keep the commands of God, to submit and be meek before Him means we must be bold among men. Martin Luther King Jr. knew this truth. In his letter from a Birmingham jail, King makes the observation, one day the South will know that when these disinherited children of God sat down at lunch counters, they were in reality standing up for what is best in the American dream and for the most sacred values in our Judeo-Christian heritage. The quality of meekness, then, in the biblical literature is not weakness. It is not conformity and submission to the patterns of domination rampant in this world. Rather, meekness is directed towards God. God who calls us never to bend the knee to injustice, but rather to stand for those who are oppressed. So when we dream of the promised land, a land where equality and justice reign, we know that the meekness we take on before God looks like boldness among men. Remember, brothers and sisters, when you bow before the throne of heaven, you still hold your head higher than the towers of the kingdoms of this world. And that to kneel before God means to stand up for those who the world would keep down. Then and only then are the meek truly blessed. Then and only then shall the meek inherit